Welcome, dear students. Today we shall learn about the critical evaluation of the revival of political theory. The main objective of the lecture is to understand the contemporary debates on the revival of political theory through the works of John Rawls, Nozick and Nussbaum, and also to understand the challenges of liberal society. To begin with John Rawls, an American political philosopher in the liberal tradition, his theory of justice as fairness envisions a society of free citizens holding equal basic rights, cooperating within an egalitarian economic system. His account of political liberalism addresses the legitimate use of political power in a democracy, aiming to show how enduring unity may be achieved despite the diversity of worldviews that free institutions allow. John Rawls opined that both moral theory and natural science must begin with data. The data for science are empirical observations and the data for ethical theory are moral judgments. Moral judgments are equally valid source of knowledge, arguments and analysis. They cannot be set aside or ignored on the ground that it is not based on empiricism. Rawls' two principles of justice basically require equality in assigning individuals basic rights and duties and express that if the less fortunate gets advantages, social or economical inequalities can be accepted. Such inequalities exclude justifying persons' labor that strive for more advantages. Then, although what suffers a loss for others' advantage can be convenience, it cannot be justice. The two prominent criticisms of Rawls' political thought was made by Michael Sandel through Liberalism and Limits of Justice and by Robert Nozick through his work on Anarchy, State and Utopia. Sandel argues that Rawls' theory presupposes the human person as an unencumbered self, devoid of any pre-existing commitments to family, religion, community and tradition. Sandel's critique of Rawls is part of what emerged in the 1980s as the debate over communitarianism and liberalism. The force of that communitarian critique motivated Rawls to engage in a reconsideration of his views in a theory of justice. And this reevaluation of his position ultimately culminated into major restatement of his position in Political Liberalism, which was published a little over 2 decades after A Theory of Justice. Justice as fairness is presented as a comprehensive liberal doctrine which requires that all members of its well-ordered society affirm that same doctrine. But given the plurality of views that persists under free institutions, Rawls has now come to recognize that the agreement that theory of justice presupposed is impossible within liberal political order. This kind of well-ordered society contradicts the fact of reasonable pluralism and hence political liberalism regards that society as impossible. Accordingly, a main aim of political liberalism is to show that the idea of the well-ordered society in theory may be reformulated so as to take account of the fact of reasonable pluralism. This transformation in Rawls' approach accounts for the very different set of questions and priorities that inform Rawls' investigation in political liberalism. When Rawls formulates the guiding question of political liberalism, he takes explicit stock of the problem of religious pluralism. How is it possible for those affirming a comprehensive doctrine, religious or non-religious, and in particular doctrines based on religious authority such as the Church or the Bible, also to hold a reasonable political conception of justice that supports a constitutional democratic society? This explains the heightened emphasis in political liberalism on the question of how to achieve stability and legitimacy in a pluralistic society, encompassing citizens who are committed to diverse viewpoints. The key innovation of political liberalism involves the introduction of the idea of public reason. According to Rawls, public reason is the form of reason that should govern citizens of a liberal democracy in deliberating about constitutional essentials and questions of basic justice. While citizens will continue to hold divergent metaphysical, moral and religious commitments in private, the ideal that Rawls constructs would require them to draw upon publicly shared principles in political deliberation. Rawls hopes that by adopting his prescription, citizens in a constitutional regime will be able to reach an overlapping consensus on political questions while preserving their commitment to a diversity of viewpoints, which Rawls emphasizes will inevitably include both religious and non-religious, liberal and non-liberal values. Dear students, let's talk about the minimal state, the only justifiable state. To move ahead to Nozick, he seeks to justify the minimal state against the individualist anarchist. He opposes the arguments for a more extensive state and their idea of distributive justice. To Nozick, the only justifiable state is the minimum state, which does not violate individuals' rights as its functions are limited to protection of individuals against force, theft, fraud and enforcement of contracts. He sets out two requirements for a state. The first one, appropriate monopoly of force in a given territory, and the second one, the provision of protection by the state within its geographical boundaries. In the minimal state, when disputes arise and enforcement of law is required, Nozick hypothetically argues that people might form, I quote, mutual protection associations, unquote, in order to defend themselves and to exercise their right to rectification. Under such an arrangement, all members of the association are on call to defend and enforce the rights of other members, meaning that everyone is always on call and any member may call upon any other member or members for protection. This begs the question if everyone in the real world would be ready to be on call. One does not have to be a cynic to dispute with this notion, but a mere depiction of human nature in any context would serve to disagree with this imaginary Good Samaritan role, which is rather unscrupulous of human nature and behavior. Nozick contends, initially there may be several protective associations within the same geographical area. When clients from different agencies enter into dispute and the agencies cannot agree on how to resolve the matter, they too will enter into conflict. The result of such conflict will be that over time a natural monopoly will occur. Eventually, there will be only one protective association within a geographical area, which is called the dominant protective association. The evolution process of this dominant protective association invites criticism, such as Nozick is calling for conflict rather than providing a pragmatic solution. The theory also fails detail whether this dominant protective association would be private or public entities, and whether it would be charging people any fee or if it is free of cost. Ironically, Nozick does not consider how the state comes about. He opines self-interest in his state of nature will ultimately give rise to the state. A critical mind would stop short of assenting to this claim as to how self-interest could give rise to a state, if at all. Dear students, now let us discuss the entitlement theory. Having disregarded the theory of distributive justice of Rawls, Nozick, influenced by Locke, puts forward his entitlement theory of justice. According to Nozick, if the world were wholly just, the following inductive definition would exhaustively cover the subject of justice in holdings. Number 1, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. Number 2, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. Number 3, no one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. To put it simply, a person's holdings are just if acquired through just original acquisition or just transfer or through rectification of injustices in the two senses. Justice in acquisition maintains that a person who acquires a holding justly is entitled to that holding. That is, how things that were previously not owned by anyone can be acquired by an individual. According to justice in transfer, a person who acquires a holding justly in transfer from another who is entitled to that holding is entitled to that holding. That is, how ownership and possession of property can subsequently be transferred from one person to another, provided that the transfer is just and the individual is entitled to the holding, like purchase, gift and so on. There may be instances of transfer where one party believes it was a just transfer, whereas the other party in the transfer feels it was unjust on them, and that they would not have conceded to the transfer had they not been the weaker of the two parties, given the increasing influence of the dominant party to keep everyone quiet. Nozick falls far too short to provide a solution for such an instance. Now let us discuss justice in rectification. Even the briefest survey of human history reveals that the current distribution of property is as much the consequence of theft and conquest as it is the product of libertarian entitlement. Nozick explains historical entitlement is subject to the principle of rectification, which attempts to use historical information to reproduce what would have occurred if injustice had not taken place. While many injustices can be traced, many others are buried and forgotten, and hence the principle has very limited application, unless it is assumed that the least well off are most likely to have been the victims of historical injustice. Nonetheless, an attempt to rectify past injustices can affect innocent owners and undermine the certainty of legal title, suggesting that claims for rectification might be barred beyond a stipulated period of time. A commentator argues that the rectification principle is almost ridiculous hit in Nozick's own theory. It could lead to dictatorship and to very end result determined societies. It may therefore be submitted that with its temporary application, the rectification principle lacks the criteria to be a universal one. Nozick's theory on justice in holdings attracts numerous questions, such as whether the term justice here is meant only in the legal sense, or if it includes other forms of justice like social justice, economic justice, among others. This begs yet another question, whether the meaning of justice remains unchanged throughout the entitlement theory and its three subdivisions, or whether the meaning of justice is specific to every subheads of the entitlement theory. It would appear from the above that Nozick may have attempted to redefine redistribution and replace it with entitlement theory. Unfortunately, it has given rise to a lot of vexed questions without adequate answers. Nozick in general contends that people are born with fundamental individual rights. These individual rights are paramount and that there is no need for a system to achieve moral equilibrium. He rejects all end result theories, that is distributive theories such as Rawls' theory of justice. Nozick rather adopts the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant's principle of individual inviolability, that cannot be violated as a means to achieve particular ends, meaning the significance of each person's possessions of self-ownership is that people should not be used as resources or a means of achieving some end, and this is exactly what Rawls proposes to do. Nozick criticizes, it is wrong to treat people as if they are merely of instrumental worth or to sacrifice one person for another. He claims that the rights of others determine constraints on our actions. According to Nozick, the classical liberal views is that the right of people to control their bodies and actions is a property right, the right of self-ownership. He further argues for his entitlement theory, where it is permissible for people to have and hold property on however an unequal basis, provided it was acquired legitimately in the first place. Thus, if someone acquired a holding justly, any interference with his holdings, that is via imposition of tax, would violate his rights. Dear students, now I will explain the Rawls versus Nozick's distribution theories. In criticism of Rawls, Nozick argues that Rawls in his theory, Justice as Fairness, invocates a group in his original position instead of individuals. Nozick disregards Rawls' theory as he thinks the latter's theory favors the lower spectrum of the society and causes inequality in terms of the average gains made by different people, as less endowed gain more than the talented. He states that Rawls' original position only lets one to consider the results of distribution, but not how it came about. Rawls' theory of redistribution or patterned theories, as Nozick calls it, he believes it involves interference with individual liberties. On the contrary, Nozick proposes distribution according to intellect, and as such, the more the intelligent, the more he gets. Any group or individuals that control resources and allocate shares interfere with the recipient's lives. As regards Nozick's strongest of oppositions against redistribution, many philosophers and academics are very critical of him. The very person who Nozick is influenced by, John Locke, suggests that taxes should be levied in proportion to the property protected by the state. According to Adam Smith, the subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government in proportion to the revenue which they subjectively enjoy under protection of the state. Epstein, a libertarian, endorses the idea of broad-based or comprehensive income tax on the basis that everything of value protected by government is subject to taxation. In consequence, it appears that libertarian principles can be relied upon to support all major taxes, then why not Nozick's? However, Stein argues that Nozick disregards any consideration of social utility in anarchy, state and utopia. Stein contends Nozick's redistribution as immensely burdensome, not providing very great benefits, and that he would object to redistribution even if it relieved enormous suffering among the poor and imposed only the most negligible of burdens on the rich. Since Nozick is willing to find hidden elements in opposing theories, he cannot, in principle, complain when others do the same to his theory, and so Nozick's failure to mention the origin of these stringent rights may open the door to an argument that the appeal of those rights is ultimately not based on considerations of aggregate well-being. Dear students, let's move ahead to talk about call for libertarian rights. To what extent does it make sense? According to Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, Rawls does not support unconditional property rights as a part of a libertarian entitlement, but Nozick does. To Nozick, for a just society, individual liberties including the rights of property ownership, free exchange, free transfer and free inheritance must be guaranteed, and the institutions are needed for these rights are essential requirements for the reasons of justice. Unfortunately, Nozick is ready to leave matters in the hands of these institutions rather than calling for any revision based on assessment of outcomes. Sen argues, what if the collectivity of what are taken to be just institutions generate terrible results for the people in that society without actually violating their immediate concerns, such as the guarantee of libertarian rights? It can be shown that economic and political forces that generate even gigantic famines can work to yield that result without violating anyone's libertarian rights. Sen maintains Nozick's recognition of the problems that his system could lead to, where he proceeded to make a possible exception to the case in which the system advocated by him, with complete priority of libertarian rights, would lead to what he called catastrophic moral horror. Nozick does, however, leave the question open. The question of whether these side constraints reflecting rights are absolute or whether they may be violated in order to avoid catastrophic moral horror, and if the latter, what the resulting structure might look like, which Nozick largely hopes to avoid. Nozick puts overarching emphasis on the self-evident nature of the importance of liberty. Nozick's individual rights conception is a fallacy of an illusory individualistic world, which is in a stark contrast with the real world we live in, consisting of society, community and a greater being. the state. Although Nozick conceded to the notion of a minimal state, later, rather than opting to be inclined to anarchy, it gives rise to the question whether any action done by the minimal state against the individual would not be equivalent to encroaching the inviolable individual rights that Nozick himself advocates for. Saint Ackley articulates, and I quote, inflexible insistence on exacting and highly demanding rules does not give the idea of justice its due, unquote. Dear students, let us talk about the capability approach. The most well-known and influential attempt to complete the capabilities approach can be found in the writings of the feminist philosopher Martha Nussbaum. She draws heavily on Aristotle in an effort to develop a definite list of central human capabilities that are life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play and political and material control over one's environment. According to Nussbaum, this list isolates those human capabilities that can be convincingly argued to be of central importance in any human life, whatever else the person pursues or chooses. It therefore provides basic political principles that should be embodied in constitutional guarantees, human rights, legislation and development policy. Here Nussbaum encourages us to encounter and learn from other cultures and societies in an effort to move towards a shared account of the core human capabilities. This approach involves internal criticism of local values and practices by appealing to external standards. In theory, this approach is promising, although in practice there are times when one might want to challenge the motives for encouraging value rejection, particularly in poor countries. Dear students, while concluding this lecture, I shall say that the Rawlsian political liberalism and the justice principle, Nozick's obsession with the individual rights and his entitlement theory, and Nussbaum's capability approach does bring the change in the process of observation and acceptance in the diverse society. Talking about the collective good of human beings is merely to obscure the fact that an individual is being used to benefit another. Here, Nozick characterizes rights to liberty in terms of giving the individual control over certain decisions, and each person may exercise his rights as he chooses, but there is no guarantee of any outcome. It is only a right to the choice of action. Evidently, Nozick's error lie in his false assumption of prioritizing conditions of freedom for single individuals rather than considering the conditions of freedom for all individuals, that is, the community as a whole. If one is discussing the well-being of the society or the community as a whole, the goodness and positivity engulfs all individuals in that society or community. Such erroneous assumptions may have led to oppose redistribution theories, especially of that of Rawls theory, which aims at welfare of the society as a whole without neglecting the poor and underprivileged. Dear students, I hope you gained some knowledge on the critical evaluation. I look forward to our discussion in the upcoming sessions. Thank you.